The Enlightenment was a powerful and diverse cultural movement of the 18th century, trumpeting the merits of science, practical improvements, and polite interaction in the burgeoning public sphere of coffee houses and cheap print media. It was an exciting time of increasing networks of communication, with information spreading through individuals interacting in ways resembling our digital age. Now I want to address the Enlightenment from a little different point of view, starting with a story about the Carmelites of Compiègne. Now, the people of Paris during the French Revolution normally screamed and jeered at the prisoners as they were hauled through the streets to the guillotine. But not this time. The onlookers stood still in shocked silence. The condemned were nuns, and they were singing along their way of the cross. Hardened by a revolution that stripped the city of its religious past, Parisians now listened, dumbstruck, as the women chanted Vespers, the Office of the Dead, and the Salve Regina. The sacred words welled up from their hearts as much as from the very depths of Christian culture. This was July 17th, 1794. These Carmelites of Compiègne were 16 nuns condemned as traitors by the Governmental Committee of Public Salvation. The women offered their lives for the church in France and for an end to the constant executions known as the Reign of Terror. At the very foot of the guillotine, the prioress, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, summoned the youngest nun to step forward first. She knelt before her superior. Her voice sounded out. "Permission to die, Mother?" Mother Teresa of St. Augustine responded, "Go, my daughter." The young nun climbed the steps, intoning Psalm 117, "Praise the Lord, all ye nations. Praise him, all ye people." She waved aside the executioner and the valet, who normally helped prisoners into position on the guillotine. Her radiance, dignity, and sense of purpose impressed those watching. Her feet left the scaffold as the plank tipped forward into horizontal position. The valet adjusted it so that her neck appeared directly in the yoke, beneath the triangular blade. The blade fell. Each nun mounted the platform in the same way. Then there was one less voice singing. No one had ever seen anything like this before. A whole religious community executed together. After the last head fell and all was quiet, the bodies were stripped and dumped in a mass grave. 10 days later, the man most responsible for the mass executions, Maximilien Robespierre, fell from power. He met the blade of the guillotine just as had the Carmelites. It seemed their sacrifice had indeed been accepted by God to end the reign of terror. Since these events, it has appeared to many that the religious antagonism of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution it helped create signaled a decisive rejection of Christianity. The uncompromising stance of figures such as the Carmelites of Compiègne on the one hand, and Robespierre and company on the other, seemed to prove that the conflict of the 18th century forever separated Christ from the Enlightenment, faith from enlightened reason, and religion from modern history, as decisively as the guillotine had once separated heads from bodies. For a long time, Christian memory of the 18th century supported the conclusion that modernity was a secular project to be opposed. Mainstream historians largely agreed with this dichotomous assessment though reversing its valuation. Peter Gay, in The Enlightenment, The Rise of Modern Paganism, 1966, defined only non-religious thinkers as enlightened. Gay's work implied no serious Christian engagement with the Enlightenment existed. It could not have existed. Modernity is, by implication, a secular project to be celebrated. This dialectic of Enlightenment versus Christianity, sustained by the historical memories of both Christians and secular historians, has deeply shaped the accepted meta-narrative of the last 300 years. But what if this picture is deeply flawed? Since the turn of the 21st century, a new generation of historians has made a provocative discovery. A full-scale religious enlightenment existed throughout the 18th century that their colleagues had overlooked, intentionally or not. In his 2008 book, The Religious Enlightenment, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews from London to Vienna, David Sorkin argued that the Enlightenment was not only compatible with religious faith, but even conducive to it. Quote, "The Enlightenment made possible new iterations of faith," Sorkin wrote. "Religion lost neither its place nor its authority in European society and culture. If we trace modern culture to the Enlightenment, its foundations were decidedly religious," Sorkin wrote. Now, other historians have made a strong case for a decidedly Catholic Enlightenment. Ulrich Lehner, Jeffrey Burson, and Christopher M.S. Johns, and a whole gaggle of books have cast shadows over the bright skies of the secular-only Enlightenment idea, to such an extent that a mainstream figure like Margaret S. Jacob has felt the need to remind the world of the secular Enlightenment, once again in her 2019 book by that title. There's more and more reason to hold that the dialectical view pitting the rise of modernity and the Enlightenment against religion is wrong. The Enlightenment was not simply French, and the French Enlightenment was not simply the cause of the French Revolution. It was not a pure set of ideas labeled anti-Christian, because it was not just one thing. Historians have shown how the American and British Enlightenments greatly differed from the French, as they were more interested in the politics of liberty and the social importance of virtue than abstract reason. As one historian argued, the Enlightenment offered a, quote, method of approach to the universe, a means, not a set of preordained ends. A method of approach to the universe. That's a helpful way to think about the Age of Enlightenment. So this Enlightenment method was a way of living tolerantly and thinking freely in the new public sphere. It stressed the human, thus resembling classical and Renaissance humanism, but more oriented toward practical improvement. Kant defined the Enlightenment as having, quote, courage to use your own reason. But this did not necessarily lead to unbelief. Many Enlighteners, or people of the Enlightenment thinkers, many Enlighteners thought the close relationship was obvious between using one's own reason, free speech, and religious freedom. See the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, for example. So this implied both rights, free speech, and duties to participate in shaping the wider culture for the good. The Age of Enlightenment was a contested space in which religious people participated, engaged, and sometimes conflicted with their surrounding culture. Now, my argument in Rethinking the Enlightenment, Faith in the Age of Reason, pictured here, my argument is that Christians in particular interact with the Enlightenment in three ways. The first was conflict, often imposed, as in the example of the Carmelites of Compiègne. Thus, one can speak of a conflictual Enlightenment, made up of characters such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Robespierre, and others, who often attacked Christianity. In addition, however, there were Christian Enlighteners who pursued a second kind of interaction through engagement. The Enlightenment Pope, so to speak, Pope Benedict XIV, or the author of The Science of Rational Devotion, Ludovico Muratori, or the first female mathematician to publish a text in her field, Maria Agnesi. Figures like this accepted certain Enlightenment assumptions about knowledge and human nature that shaped their work as devout Catholics. Then there was a third response to the Enlightenment: retreat. One could ignore it, mind one's own business and stay home, so to speak, to build up Christian culture from within. In other words, retreat into one's house to work from home. Not a military maneuver, backing out of a tough spot, but a spiritual movement inward to nurture the household of faith. So from this vantage point, Enlightenment culture and Christian culture ran parallel to each other, not colliding like in conflict, not overlapping like in engagement, but just kind of developing in tandem. So, I think it's helpful to think of the relationship between religion and the Enlightenment as a dialogue or a chess game, which Voltaire loved playing with the priest Father Adam, who said Mass for Voltaire's Ferney household. Each of these three modes of interaction, conflict, engagement, and retreat, can be thought of as a strategy involving different strengths and weaknesses. Christians discerned the need for each of these strategies depending on their circumstances. I argue it was, and is, ultimately necessary to integrate all of them for a fruitful relationship between religion and culture. So, the conflictual Enlightenment. What was the nature of the fight? What was the conflict all about? Well, I focus on three major themes of the conflictual Enlightenment. The first was discounting religion. The famous Enlightenment atheist Baron d'Holbach, for example, argued God was a being like any other, and a mean one at that, and that we need to turn our attention from heaven to earth. This line of thinking certainly helped expand the sphere of the secular and inspired anti-clerical attacks against the church. So discounting religion did happen in the 18th century, and the Baron d'Holbach is one example. The second area of conflict was more subtle. Again, by conflict, I mean conflict with a Christian worldview and this emerging Enlightenment worldview. The second area of conflict was more subtle. This was the idea that individual reason is the sole criterion of truth. It assumed that even the highest questions, like those of faith, can be solved by the single, unaided human mind. This methodological individualism undermined the kind of participatory knowledge one gained in communities, like that of the Carmelites, for example, that we began with. It also negated tradition, that reservoir of a rationality both deeper and wider than that of any individual mind. Whereas conflictual enlighteners, so these are the people who are conflicting, right, like Voltaire and Rousseau, whereas conflictual enlighteners took natural reason solely as their guide in religious matters, imagining themselves as their own highest authority, Christians were obliged to take their ultimate principles from outside themselves. This situation created conditions of conflict. The third area of clash was the perfectibility of humans on their own strength. Here we meet the birth of the idea of progress and the rivalry of two different soteriologies, or visions of salvation, worldly and Christian. As one reads in Rousseau, the source of evil is not original sin or personal sin, but unjust social structures. Because Rousseau connected his vision to politics, this suggests that the most dangerous side of the conflictual Enlightenment, from the Christian point of view, was not so much the liberation of the secular. Pope Benedict XVI, after all, spoke of a positive secularity in which the secular worldly sphere enjoys a proper autonomy from religion, and thereby should be studied on its own terms. Rather, the real danger was the insertion into modern politics of the idea of human perfectibility, the longing for this worldly wholeness. This longing powered the Reign of Terror that crushed the Carmelites and the terrible story of modern political religion ever since. How did Christians respond to these three areas of conflict? Well, besides the Carmelites of Compiègne, whose conflict with the Enlightenment took the form of martyrdom, there were also those who engaged in intellectual conflict. The French priest and apologist Nicolas Bergier, 1718 to 1790, for example, combated the ideas of Rousseau through his writings. The Archbishop of Paris, Christophe de Beaumont, 1703 to 1781, wrote a pastoral letter against Rousseau's book, Émile, condemning his denial of original sin. The writer James Boswell, 1740 to 1795, argued with Voltaire at his Ferney estate over religion, a great Bible before them. Imagine the image of the chess game again. Then there were the French peasants of the Vendée region who fought the French Revolution. Politicians such as Edmund Burke and William Wilberforce took the battle into enemy lines when they defended religion and human dignity in the British Parliament. The Christian strategy of conflict with the Enlightenment produced some of the most dramatic stories of the age. It had a negative side, too, from the Christian point of view. It contributed to a destructive conflict mentality. Right? So if you just focus on conflict all the time, this can warp the minds. In Catholics who are always looking for a fight then, their anti-Protestantism, for example, contributed to abuses of power at this time. Catholics even attacked each other all during the 1700s, as in Jansenists versus Jesuits. This internecine warfare weakened Catholics in France and beyond, creating a resentful environment favorable to the conflictual Enlightenment itself. There was a need to not only conflict with the Enlightenment, but to engage it too. The dramatic conflict of the 18th century seemed to prove the Enlightenment versus Christianity narrative. But let us consider the entire matter from a different direction. Let us go to Milan in 1739. We are in the beautiful Palazzo Agnesi. There, Maria Agnesi, one of the talented daughters of the family, is debating in Latin, so everyone could understand, questions of philosophy and science. She could also speak French, German, and Greek, so if you have a question, you can ask in any number of languages. The prestigious audience is seated in a room richly furnished with a harpsichord, mirrors, and gilded candle holders. 40 modern paintings in identical frames decorated the walls with landscapes and seascapes and scenes from the life of Christ and the New Testament. The largest of all pictured the resurrection. As the night descended, uniformed servants lit candles and brought ice creams and sorbets for the guests as they continued to listen to the lovely 20-year-old woman speak. The summer evening in 1739 was hot, but the young woman's combination of academic bravery, skill in debate, and virtuous modesty fascinated them. When she was finished, her talented sister played the harpsichord in the background and sang songs of her own composition. This woman, Maria Agnesi, was also a devout Catholic who volunteered much of her time at local hospitals caring for sick and homeless women. In fact, at the end of a hard day's work volunteering, sometimes she would come back from the hospital work and change clothes and then sweep into this salon kind of situation like pictured here and assume her role as a sophisticated intellectual, changing costumes kind of like a superhero. Maria Agnesi became a minor celebrity in northern Italy and beyond for her intellect and her charity. She was the first woman in history to publish a book of mathematics in her own name. It was called Analytical Institutions of 1748 and explained the new techniques of differential and integral calculus to general readers. Her work was so brilliant, the Bologna Academy of Sciences made her a member. This was almost unprecedented for a woman of that time. Her book was translated into French and English. It was considered the best introduction to its subject for decades afterward. In addition, the University of Bologna, then under papal control, offered Agnesi an honorary lectureship in mathematics. Agnesi was hailed across Europe. So Agnesi's story introduces a different sort of interaction with the Enlightenment than conflict. For only a small number of Catholic writers in the 18th century combated the Enlightenment as a whole. Instead, many Catholics and other Christians and Jews engaged the Enlightenment. These religious enlighteners, such as Maria Agnesi, share the optimism of the age about human effort toward improving life. They engage and broadcast modern knowledge and advanced the education of women. The story of the Catholic Enlightenment in my book ranges from Agnesi's Milan to the enlightened papacy of Benedict XIV in Rome, from the Academy of Sciences in Bologna to the monasteries of enlightened monks, Benedictine monks in particular, in Germany, as at Kremsmünster Abbey, pictured here. The Catholic Enlightenment demonstrated both a sophisticated strategy of cultural engagement in the 18th century and certain dangers inherent in that engagement. Now, the Catholic Enlightenment in particular existed from about 1700 to 1803, when Napoleon's armies dissolved Benedictine monasteries in Germany. Catholic Enlighteners engaged the information revolution of the time. They promoted social charity over mysticism, critical thought over blind obedience, rational devotion over emotional exuberance, local church governance over papal centralization, the modern Newton over the ancient Aristotle in physical science, and the freedom of scholarship over suppression of new ideas. Their views revealed an optimism about human nature, reason, and improvement of life in this world. They took seriously the challenges of both faith and reason. Catholic Enlightenment spirituality rejected the earlier Baroque age spirituality of the 1600s, which they characterized as theatrical, emotional, and externalized. It confused spirit and matter, they thought. The Science of Rational Devotion, 1747, however, by Ludovico Muratori, clearly distinguished between spirit and matter. One commentator summarized the argument of the book this way: it might seem as if good taste and learning have little to do with devotion. In reality, however, they are deeply connected, for rationality clarifies the principles of religion and delineates the boundaries beyond which devotional zeal should not go. This is important not only to eliminate superstition from Catholic devotion, it is also important for the wider society by avoiding giving a wrong impression of Catholicism to people of other religious backgrounds. Rational devotion would minimize that hatred and animosity, which are so destructive of unity among those whose civil and political interests are the same. The Catholic Enlightenment formed Maria Agnesi, in particular, in a lay spirituality oriented toward inner devotion, outward towards social charity, and upward toward intellectual development. One author wrote, her religious formation was through the Theatines, an order devoted to helping clergy and laity live out their faith through practical charity. She agreed that Baroque communal religious practice tended to stimulate fantasy, credulity, and fatalism rather than the intellect and clear understanding of religious duty. In this way, through her religious formation, she absorbed the age of reason around her, an example of how the Enlightenment filtered into 18th century Catholicism. Within Agnesi's palace, Maria's chapel was located next to her study. The one opened upon the other through a doorway. That was symbolic of the Catholic Enlightenment as a whole. She believed in an intimate relationship between mathematics and holiness. She also absorbed a, quote, metaphysically modest, unquote, approach to knowledge. This is a phrase used by this author here, Mazzotti. It's a very helpful one. This metaphysically modest approach to knowledge, this was an Enlightenment social strategy, advising discretion and veiling one's highest and most intimate beliefs concerning the nature of reality. These intimate parts are not necessarily shameful, but out of a healthy sense of modesty, one should not bring them into public. They belong in the inner sanctum of religious colleges. Let me explain a little more. So, in the new public spaces of salons, coffee houses, and print media, rules of genteel conversation de-emphasize dogmatic questions such as the attributes of God and the nature of the church. it was more appropriate to discuss open-ended scientific and social questions in these public places because their inferior epistemological status made them metaphysically safe topics. In other words, questions answerable through empirical knowledge were more suitable for polite conversation because they did not necessarily threaten someone's highest allegiances or deepest fears. One finds this metaphysical modesty in Agnesi's approach to knowledge. Agnesi also contributed to the woman question of the early 1700s, which debated the value of women's education. She gave a Latin oration at age 9 on why it is appropriate to educate women. She and others realized that bad science had led to a poor theology of woman and thus problematic biblical hermeneutics and blaming women primarily for the fall of man in Genesis. But for Agnesi and other Catholic enlighteners, the soul has no sex, inspired by Descartes in that, which meant that men and women were fundamentally equal. Agnesi's work helped put Catholicism at the cutting edge of modern thought in Milan. This was all made possible due to the Catholic Enlightenment. Now, a third way to look at the Enlightenment is the practical Enlightenment. And here we go to the English-speaking world. We leave behind France, we leave behind Italy and Germany, into the English-speaking world, full of practical men and women who were attempting, through coffee houses and traveling lecturers, to connect Newtonian mechanics to practical invention. This was going on throughout the 18th century and laid the basis for the Industrial Revolution, which has revolutionized modern history in the material aspect of life, for sure. And it's in this context of the practical Enlightenment in the English-speaking world that I want to talk about the third strategy by which Christians interacted with this age of enlightenment, the retreat strategy. Now, just reviewing, the conflict strategy that we started off with had weaknesses, right? It led to the conflict mentality too much sometimes. And so there was also a need for the engagement strategy to counterbalance conflict, and we've seen that. Yet engagement had weaknesses too. Openness to one's cultural environment can pose serious dangers if one lacks vigilance about the thresholds of Christian culture. Christians needed not only to conflict and to engage the Enlightenment, but also to nurture and guard Christian culture from within. So they withdrew from the world into households and religious societies and churches. This sheltering strategy tried to integrate faith into all dimensions of life. What I call householding pled for synthesis rather than analysis. It sought to unify instead of to distinguish, as the Catholic Enlightenment was good at doing, distinguishing and analyzing. The retreat strategy interacted profoundly with the wider Enlightenment movement as a whole, as we will see. As an example of this retreat strategy that Christians used in relation to the Enlightenment, in action, I turn to the household of Susanna and Samuel Wesley of Epworth, England. Two of their sons, John Wesley, 1703 to 1791, and Charles Wesley, 1707 to 1788, would do much to advance the, quote, new evangelization of the day through the Methodist movement, as did St. Louis de Montfort among Catholics in Western France. Now, the Wesley family lived in the large timber-framed thatched rectory for the medieval parish church of St. Andrew. Samuel Wesley was an Anglican priest there. He was Oxford educated and committed to his duties. The home was surrounded by 3 acres of land used for farming and supplemental income. Now, Susanna is undoubtedly one of the great Christian women of history. She was the 25th of 25 children. At age 13, she left her father's dissenter church to join the Church of England. Her father had taught her to think independently, and so respected her decision. After her marriage, Susanna had 19 pregnancies, but due to high infant mortality, only 10 children survived. Assisted by servants and wet nurses, she managed the household, gardening, and early education of the children until the boys were sent to school in London around age 10. Amid debt and illness and helping her children grow up and find spouses, she wrote. Her many letters, her diary, and one publication, which is a theological treatise against Calvinist predestination, her many writings reveal a practical theologian and competent Christian apologist. Now, Susanna's sense of vocation embraced the entire household. Each child was a talent committed to her for improvement. She advised herself in her diary, quote, "Be assured, you must give an account at the last great day how you discharged this trust. And if through your default any soul miscarry, how will you hold up your face in the last judgment?" She once wrote to her husband how she discharged this trust when he was away for a few months at an annual meeting of the Church of England. Quote, "As I am a woman, so I am also mistress of a large family. The children and even the servants she viewed as entrusted to her by the great Lord of all the families, both of heaven and earth." She began to think of herself evangelically, or as an evangelist of the gospel to those around her. Quote, "I thought I might speak to those with whom I conversed with more warmth and affection," she wrote to her husband. "I resolved to begin with my own children." Now, Susanna Wesley's personal prayer life nourished her sense of vocation within her household, but this retreat strategy of this retreating into her household and in prayer life also connected her inner life to the people beyond the domestic threshold. For example, once with her husband away on priestly duties, Susanna led the household in singing psalms and reading aloud sermons in the warm, spacious kitchen. One of the young servants told his parents about the gatherings, and they wanted to come too. Then others that heard of it begged leave also, so our company increased to about 30, she wrote. "Last Sunday, I believe, we had above 200, and yet many more went away for want of room to stand." Now, her sons, John and Charles Wesley, along with their friend, George Whitefield, extended this family ministry beyond the neighborhood to, incredibly, the entire English-speaking world. They brought the Christian faith to the common people of England, who had not seen such preachers since the medieval days of the Franciscans. This was happening in the very heart of the age of the Enlightenment. On May 27, 1742, for example, John Wesley arrived at Newcastle in northern England. He had scarcely seen such drunkenness, cursing, and swearing, even from the mouths of small children. Quote, "Surely this place is ripe for him who came not to call the righteous but sinners to repentance," he wrote. Wesley proceeded to the poorest and most contemptible part of town. He began to sing. Soon 3 or 4 people looked out to see what the matter was. Then 400 or 500 gathered. Then 12 to 1,500. Wesley preached on Isaiah 53:5. "He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities." He wrote, "Observing the people, when I had done, to stand gaping and staring upon me with the most profound astonishment, I told them, 'If you desire to know who I am, my name is John Wesley. At 5 in the evening, with God's help, I designed to preach here again.'" When the appointed time came, quote, "I never saw so large a number of people together." He spoke of the love and healing power of God. After preaching, he recorded, "The poor people were ready to tread me underfoot out of pure love and kindness. It was some time before I could possibly get out of the press." Now, by the time Wesley died in 1791, he had traveled 250,000 miles by horseback around the English-speaking world and delivered 40,000 sermons. Crowds regularly numbered in the thousands. And so, in this way, Wesley was taking advantage of the kind of practical enlightenment going on around him, particularly with better roads allowed for better traveling, but also cheap publishing and sort of the cranking out of books and pamphlets that are affecting and influencing the 18th century world here. So the result was that England in the late 1700s was perhaps in many ways more Christian than it had been in the early 1700s, challenging the idea of linear secularization in the modern world. The birth of evangelicalism during the Age of Enlightenment was not only a paradox. It also made the 1700s the age of the Holy Spirit as much as it was the age of reason. The explosion of evangelical energy that emerged out of the Christian retreat strategy in this time changed fundamental assumptions about political authority in the American colonies and about human dignity in the British abolitionist movement led by evangelicals by 1790. In this way, the Christian new evangelization of the day shaped the very development of the Enlightenment itself. It is also possible to even argue that Wesley himself was an Enlightenment figure, and some have argued this. His focus on education, he was Oxford educated himself, his focus on reason, on writing, he wrote about medicine, but above all, his influence is coming from Locke in his life and a kind of spiritual empiricism, the focus on religious experience as analogous to physical experience through the sciences. I think it's possible to view him in this way. However, just like the conflict strategy had weaknesses and the engagement strategy had some weaknesses, so too did the retreat strategy have some weaknesses. Wesley's followers did not always maintain the balance he did. So, some of them, coming to emphasize the heart over the brain, fostered intense emotionalism and introspection. Where intellectual engagement was lacking, this left a weak basis for sustaining long-term faith. Integrating life based solely on faith risked overstepping the proper autonomy of the secular order and of different fields of knowledge. This could create confusion and feed superstition. That is why many Catholic enlighteners and Anglican bishops in England, for example, viewed popular missions with suspicion. Intellectual engagement with the Enlightenment was necessary to balance the other weaknesses in the retreat strategy too. Fear of human nature for the sake of, quote, holiness, led to joyless rigidity and a Christian pessimism that scandalized Voltaire and others who saw the goodness of natural human desires. Without engaging the Enlightenment, the Puritan temptation could lead to pseudo-retreat from the world based on moral self-righteousness. Quote, these are narrow minds, Diderot wrote in the Encyclopédie. Quote, deformed souls who are indifferent to the fate of the human race and who are so enclosed in their little group that they see nothing beyond its special interest, unquote. That was one of the risks and weaknesses of the retreat strategy. So, there's a need for all strategies, all three. There was in the 18th century, and there is today. Conflict for conflict's sake, without engagement, is senseless. Engagement without conflict is weak. Either strategy without retreat lacks wisdom. Retreat without conflict or engagement is stultifying. Each strategy represents a different intention. They all seek to live out the relationship between religion and culture and between personal faith and public life. But the emphasis differs with each one. Since every person cannot pursue every strategy constantly with equal effectiveness, there is need to discern which is necessary at the time. The vocation and talents of individual people or of whole cultures indicate which strategy makes the most sense for them. The porous boundaries between strategies mean that it is possible to migrate from one to the other, depending on the season. Carefully integrating even two of the strategies could make for a more effective and psychologically sound relationship between religion and culture. And different parts of the kingdom of God pursue all of them, however. A strong, intellectually sophisticated, and evangelically oriented Christianity can emerge, as it did in the age of the Enlightenment.